Be quiet. I heard something. It's moving around outside. I can't talk too much, because I think it'll hear me. Beware the full moon, and enjoy these 5 terrifying sightings of dogmen and werewolves. Like this video if you don't want me to get eaten. But share this video if you want me to get eaten, and you hope I taste delicious. If you have a story of your own, be sure to share it with us at darkstories.org or darknessprevails.org/submit. I'd love to hear some alien encounters. Now, let's begin. An anonymous story from 4chan. I used to go visit my grandpa outside of Bozeman in the winters. Grandpa is this tiny little frail old man, but he's pretty hardy. He used to take us snowshoeing up in the mountains and carry most of the gear in his sled that he pulled behind him. It was freaking cold up there. Your snot would be frozen before it even left your nose. The times he did convince us to go out, we ended up staying in ice caves that Grandpa had carved into snowy banks earlier in the winter. And at the time out there, it got dark really early, and of course no campfires, because it was all ice and snow everywhere. One year we're out there camping with Grandpa, and he's really on the edge the whole trip. We don't ask him why, because we're stupid kids and don't think it matters, or maybe we thought it wasn't any of our business. He was acting strangely. He was irritable, with random outbursts, yelling at us for the smallest things. You should have seen how mad he got when we didn't tie a knot right, and he was furious when we didn't keep up with him fast enough. We stopped hiking at about 2 p.m. Nightfall wouldn't be for another 3.5 hours. My brother and I exchanged WTF looks with each other. We look around for his ice cave, but there isn't one. "Grandpa, where are we going to be camping?" I ask. But then Grandpa's nowhere to be found. We took our eyes off of him for one moment and he's gone. We can't find his footprints, which is strange because snowshoes leave enormous footprints that you can't miss. We backtrack and follow the trail to where we were earlier. But the footprints just end right there, right where me and my brother were when Grandpa told us to stop for the day. After a lot of deliberation, we decide to head back, following our tracks back to the main road, where we will somehow flag down a car and get someone to help us find our grandpa. We hike about an hour back the way we came when we suddenly hear a voice. "Where the hell have you kids been?" It's Grandpa, and he's pissed. He says that he was hiking along and all that, and the next time he turned around, we were gone. He says our footprints just ended about 100 paces back from wherever he was when he realized that we were gone. We tell him the same thing happened to us, and we just got back from 2 miles ahead of us on the trail. Suddenly, he goes into wild animal hyper-alert mode, stops talking. His eyes are scanning the forest around us, head pivoting side to side, trying to see everything at once. I'm freaking out, and my brother even starts crying. Grandpa won't respond when we ask him what's wrong, quietly muttering incoherently to himself. After what seems like forever, Grandpa starts moving again, simply says, "Follow me," and we do. Too scared to argue with him, but we realize that he's going in a third direction, not where we came from, and not where we were going originally. We were all hiking close together then, literally stepping on each other's feet because we're so creeped out. If it weren't for the ski poles, we would have been holding hands. We eventually emerge in a clearing. I recognize it as a lake, but you'd never know it in the winter when everything was frozen solid. We get out on the ice and walk all the way to the middle of the lake before we stop. Grandpa tells us to get out our parkas, as we're going to be staying a while. We ask him what's happening, but we don't get an answer. He gets out his binoculars and starts to scan the shoreline. This is a pretty big lake, so without binoculars, neither me nor my brother could really see anything besides little distant trees on the shore. At this point, Grandpa puts the binoculars down, unpacks a fairly large caliber revolver and holster, and puts it on his hip. He then picks the binoculars back up and points them in the same direction he was looking at a minute ago. Me and my brother both look in that direction. I can barely see something moving around. Not just one something, but several of them, all of varying sizes. They're all hanging out on the bank though. None of them leave the thick brush surrounding the lake or venture onto the ice. After a few minutes, Grandpa silently hands me the binoculars. When I look at the movement on the shore, I almost soil myself. I see 3 animals. 2 are what I can only assume are wolves, maybe coyotes, but I don't think that's what it was, because the bodies were way too long, almost snake-like. The 3rd animal is some sort of all-white thing standing on 2 legs, and the more I look at it, the stranger it appears. At first I took it to be a bear, just standing on 2 legs. Then it starts walking, pacing really, and the legs are just too long and slender to be a bear's. I sit down on the ice, lean up against my backpack, and get a more steady grip on the binoculars. I slowly realize that whatever it is, it has the approximate build of a person, but the head is clearly not that of a human. It's some sort of animal, but I can't place it. I ask my grandpa what the hell it was. My brother snatches the binoculars away from me, and when he sees it, he labels it a bear man and wants to take a few shots at it. Grandpa says he thinks it's an Indian, dressed up in animal fur, trying to blend in with the forest surroundings and the animals he's with. Says that's what they did when they hunted. I still don't stop wanting to soil myself. Because if that's an Indian in a bearskin with 2 massive, weird-looking wolves, it didn't make any sense at all. And they were following us. Even better. And they were afraid of the ice for whatever reason. It's starting to get dark, and we're still out there on the ice. We're all watching the Indian bear man thing, whatever the heck it was, with his dog-wolf creatures, slowly wandering along the coastline, clearly avoiding the lake, but trying to figure out how to get out onto it somehow. Every once in a while, they'll change direction, as though they were pacing back and forth. In the time, I have the binoculars, and I see the thing, his dogs, wolves, motionless and staring directly at us many times. No one breaks the silence for a while. When it gets too dark to see anything on the shore, Grandpa relaxes, puts down the binoculars, and actually starts to make a camp as though nothing had happened. Of course, we didn't have a tent, but we do have sleeping bags and bivy bags to keep the blowing snow off of them, and the wind off of our faces. Me and my brother look up at him like he's crazy. "We're gonna sleep out here," he says. I say something along the lines of, "What about that guy out there? He's right over there." But it didn't matter. We spent the long night in that exact spot. The next morning, we can't locate any animals or bear men after 45 minutes of scanning the trees around the lake. So it was safe, right? Grandpa declares it's safe, or safe enough to head back, and since he knows these woods well, we were going to take a different route back to the main road. After a mile, he's doubling back, staring at mountaintops and measuring angles between them with his arms, and I'm convinced he's lost. In the next moment, several things happen at once. With no warning, a huge moose gallops out of seemingly thin air and almost crushes my brother, managing to push him on the ground. Grandpa collapses for an unknown reason. The 3 of us manage to form a triangle, and then we see him, a slender person covered in white fur like a polar bear, with a bear head, or some kind of canine mask. Thing is, it looked extremely lifelike. The 2 wolf-like things are circling at a distance. The bear man lets loose a scream like you'd imagine would come from a Bigfoot, not a person. Grandpa half sits up, points his revolver, fires off 3 shots at the thing in rapid succession. There's a huge puff of snow like a silent explosion, and we can't see anything for a few moments. Then a second moose goes hurtling through, and after it's gone, the snow has settled down, and the bear man is gone too. No traces of blood to be found. We can still see one of the wolves circling us, but it's pretty far away. We proceed to book it out of the woods, taking the shortest and most direct route off the mountain. I think that Grandpa isn't really sure about what's going on, but nobody cares. We have to keep moving, and we all know it. I can see the wolf at the edge of my vision, several hundred feet out through the trees. Can't tell if it's 1 or 2 of them at that distance. We eventually do get back to Grandpa's car, which means he did know where he was going, thankfully. It's been covered in fresh snowfall since we left it there. But there's also 10-inch paw prints all over the place, on it and around it. We clean off the snow and see that there are dents in the hood, like hail fell on it, but they're right under where the paw prints were. On the drive home, we all swear to never speak of this to Grandma or to my mom. We have to swerve out of the way of a huge roadkill in the middle of the road, too. We almost drove off the road, but stopped just in time. The thing in the road that we swerved around was a huge mound of fur with no distinct animal-like forms. No head, no legs, no tail, and there was blood everywhere. It looked more like a giant skin thrown over a giant mound of flesh, and I can see it moving. Grandpa peels the heck out of there, driving home 30 miles per hour over the speed limit, and we never look back. My great-grandmother's encounter with the Loup Garou in East Texas, from MajorBatarang. My great-grandmother always used to tell a story about a werewolf-like creature called the Loup Garou. At some point in her life, according to the version my grandpa used to tell, his mom lived along the Sabine River and had some friends over one night for supper. My great-grandmother lived in a house out in the woods, a short distance from town, and everyone was about ready to start heading back. It was past dusk, but not too late, and the guests were just starting to say their goodbyes, when a wailing howl shattered through the stillness of the forest. Everyone inside the house just froze, and one of the women uttered, "Loup Garou." They began shutting the windows in a panic, locking every door. It was believed that the Loup Garou was unable to get inside a locked house. After a short time, and all the house was locked down, my great-grandmother and her guests gathered in the front parlor and hid in the shadows. From the woods rose another piercing howl, and the sounds were much closer now. As they all huddled in silence in the parlor, a heavy form stepped up onto the porch, the weight of its massive body straining the wooden planks. It walked past the door, jiggling its locked knob, and its heavy breathing fogged up the window panes as the creature stepped into the bright beams of the moonlight. It began to peer into the window, but everyone remained entirely motionless, holding their breath. The creature let out a mighty, possibly irritated howl, a howl that my grandpa said made my great-grandmother tremble years later. The beast then walked back into the woods, vanishing in the dark. The dinner party had been so scared that they all decided to stay the night, not daring to step foot outside until morning. In the morning, when they investigated the outside of the cabin, there were giant footprints in the mud all over, long claws sticking out from each of the toes. They didn't stay much longer in that house, moving into town not long after that, then soon moving into the Houston area. That's the story I used to hear from my grandpa. I personally don't know how true it is, but that's the beauty of folklore. You get to hear it, you get to decide for yourself, and sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to see the fear creeping back up in the person who experienced the story. Fear that you can't fake. Dogman doesn't just howl, he whistles. From Mr.p. I'm 31 years old. I've never been scared of the dark. Then again, I've never been alone in the middle of farms or fields or woods until I was 13, and that happens to be when this occurred. I was 13 and I was with my grandfather. He owned a little farm in West Texas in a small town. We left the house that morning at around 6 or 7 a.m., just as the sun came up in the beginning of spring. There weren't any leaves on the trees, and the grass was yellow. It was a bit cold outside at the time, so we wore jackets to go feed the cows out on the farm. As we pulled up, the cows were not waiting by the fence to get cow feed as they usually did. It was then that we heard a strange whistling sound, similar to the noise a white-tailed deer makes, but longer and kind of aerated. I looked around feeling kind of anxious, trying to see where the sound came from. I tugged on my papa's arm, saying, "What's that sound?" He raised an eyebrow as if to ask what sound. I said, "It whistled like a deer." He shrugged and then began to shake the cake so that the cows would come over. They eventually did show up, but standing in the middle of the field around their calves, as if they were trying to protect them from something. As the bull came rushing up, stopping a good 3 yards from the gate at the barn, it looked up at the hayloft at the top of the barn. It began to huff and stir up dust with its hooves, never taking its eyes off of the loft. My grandpa was growing aggravated. He began to yell out for the cows, which he never did and obviously wouldn't work. He opened the gate, pouring the cake in a line like he usually does with the cows, keeping a close eye on the bull because he was acting so aggressive and strange. The bull would not stop snorting and kicking up dust, and even though he had fresh food in front of him, the bull would not stop staring at the hayloft. Curious, I looked up at the hayloft myself. The sun was shining through into the dark loft, allowing me to see that there was someone standing in there. Someone covered in black and gray fur, standing tall enough that they had to hunch over in a 6-foot-tall loft. Their hands were clawed, with 5 digits like a person, of course, but their silhouette boasted a more German Shepherd-like head shape. It stood there above the barn doors, where the trucks were. It startled me, so I stared at it, but quite quickly I grew so afraid that I did not want to be on the side of the fence alone, so I crawled through the barbed wire fence. I hastily went over to my papa, and I told him, "Look, who's that in the hayloft?" But, like a horror movie cliche, when my grandpa turned to look, the hayloft was empty. Nothing there," he said. I then frantically explained what I saw. He told me I was just tired, that he woke me up too early, and that the bull acting goofy must have spooked me. Probably just a barn owl, he said. So we finished up with the cows. Before we knew it, we were going back home to eat breakfast. That afternoon around lunchtime, my cousins and I went out to play on the farm. My papa and dad had taken us out there. I was telling my cousins what I saw and they simply laughed at me. I decided to take a flashlight and climb the ladder to the hayloft to see if I could find any trace of it up there. As I crawled up the ladder, I noticed a smell that I'd never smelled before, and to this day, I've never smelled anything like it. It was this old coppery dirt smell, mixed with wet dog, with a hint of urine. I shone the flashlight up only to see dark hair on the floor. This startled me, so I began to shimmy down the ladder fast. I grabbed a pile of rocks and began to chunk them into the hayloft, trying to scare that thing out of the barn, but I didn't hear anything but rocks hitting the floor. I pulled out my pocket knife and forced myself to look back up there, thinking if anything came at me, I could stab it or cut it. Steadily, after a while, I crawled back up, peeking over to the fur, to see that the hay had been torn from the ropes binding it, and now there were huge claw marks in the wall, with a partially eaten deer laying there that hadn't been there before. I ran back down the ladder, yelling to my papa. After he investigated, he didn't say what it was. He simply told me that it was best to stay away from the barn. I wish I knew what that lump of fur was. I wish I knew what that thing standing in the hayloft was, and why the cows were so scared of it, but maybe it's best left a mystery. Just remember, some wolves don't howl, some of them whistle. Shapeshifter, or unnaturally large wolf, from Dakota M. This happened a few years ago on a family farm out in the country, specifically in Australia. On the farm, we have over 50 racing greyhounds that we look after every day. We had acres upon acres of green grass and crops, where I would often take some of these greyhounds out to run for hours. I loved it, but my life wasn't easy. My dad turned into a drug dealer. My mom was abused, and a lot of other things. One day, I was running around with my favorite greyhound, Delta, quite far from the farmhouse. I left my phone at home because I couldn't be bothered to bring it. We were running through a field of crops, and my mother and Nana always told me to never go too far to the side of the fields, but they would never say why. So I went around close to the border of the fields, which were greeted by a forest of trees from one side to the other. We walked and walked when I swear I heard twigs snapping and pounding thuds coming from the edge of the trees, though I couldn't see anything. By then it was getting dark, but it wasn't too noticeable. Even little Deli stopped putting her ears up from time to time towards the trees. So we began heading back, but I felt like there was something behind me. I glanced, but there was nothing. Then there was a loud snarl, followed by a crunching sound and a short howl, which made the two of us freeze. Then Delta started to growl, her ears forward, and she was baring her teeth. Then we both saw it, what appeared to be a huge, beautiful black wolf. I was confused and scared, because wolves were not around in Australia. The odd part was, it wasn't showing any signs of aggression. No baring teeth, no flat ears on its head, no odd tail movement. Delta then tucked her tail between her legs and her ears went flat, and she began to whimper. The thing that mostly drew my attention was its piercing, glowing yellow eyes, and weirdly enough, the creature gave off this vibe that actually made me feel comfortable. It stood in the long dead grass, staring at us with its ears pointed up like a statue. I took a risk and turned away quickly, running back for the house. When I made it to the top of the hill, I turned, but I could no longer see it. If anything, it may have been following me, stalking me where I couldn't see it, so we ran back home. I let Delta inside for the night, to keep her safe, as I did not want to take any chances. I of course told my mom of this, and she said I was probably seeing things. I then went to tell my Nan, who then told me a strange story. I didn't know about this, but my mother apparently had a miscarriage. They would have had a little girl before me, and she would have been my older sister. She then said that the creature may be the reincarnation of my older sister. I was dumbfounded, not sure if I believed that story. Then again, we don't have wolves here, and wolves don't get that big. But that wasn't the end of it. One day we went down to the closest shop open for dinner. When we came back, our locked front door had been smashed in. There were huge paw marks on the front porch, several times bigger than the greyhounds. Immediately, I thought of that massive wolf that I'd seen. My mother always kept a baseball bat in the car, just in case, but when she went inside, no one was in the house, and nothing had been taken. We had a camera on the front porch, so we checked it out, and I was shocked at what we saw. There was a guy dressed in black with a knife trying to picklock the door, before smashing it in. But before actually entering the home, we watched the guy throw the knife to the side and running off the porch into the darkness, as if he was in a panic at something. We should have been able to see what left the paw print, but we never did. It was like a clue as to what scared the guy, without any evidence of what could have made it. This influenced my family enough to actually call out a ranger and let them know that some kind of animal was lurking on the property and that it could be dangerous. But after all these years, I haven't seen it again. But I do know that if it truly was violent or dangerous, it would have ended me when it had the chance. Something was right outside. From GG. My best friend's parents own a small log cabin on a small, secluded river in the middle of the forest. It's about a 2-mile hike from the nearest highway. In this story, I'll refer to my best friend as M. 2 more of my friends factor into this story, and I'll refer to the one who was 16 years old as P, and the 15-year-old as J. It was mid-June of 2019. We were having a party to celebrate the end of our first year of high school. There were about 20 people who attended the party, but M, J, P, and myself stayed for the night. The actual party was very fun, and we all went swimming up and down the river. It wasn't too far from the cabin. Plus, there's a long rock that sticks out about 40 feet above the river, which we named Chicken Rock, because if you don't jump off into the water from it, you're a chicken. Personally, I love jumping off the thing, so myself and M quickly climbed up to the small outcrop. There were about 5 other people following us who wanted to jump. M and myself helped people climb up the small rock face to get to the Chicken Rock, so we were the last 2 people to actually jump off. When it came to us, I let M go first. I watched as he plummeted downward and landed into the river. As I stood on the top of the rock, I could see the forest around me, everyone swimming happily below. And if my eyes weren't deceiving me, there was something on the other side of the river in the woods. It was pretty far back, but my high vantage point allowed me to barely make out a large black shape. I have no idea what it was, but my friends started yelling at me for taking too long. When I looked back up at the figure, the thing was gone. I jumped into the river and we swam back. I said nothing because it would sound insane. We had some dinner and everyone talked, but at around 8 p.m. people who were not spending the night made their way back to where we designated a space for them to park. By 9 p.m., everyone except for myself, M, J, P, and M's family were gone. There were only 8 of us in all. My 3 friends and I went out to the edge of the river and built a small campfire. We sat around it for a good hour, talking about the school year and our summer plans. We were having a good time, but then it began to pour, and the fire was quickly put out. We walked back to the cabin and all sat down inside. As for the sleeping arrangements, my 3 friends and I would sleep on the screened-in porch, while Im's family slept inside on the couch and the bed. We went to sleep around 11 p.m. after playing some board games. No more strange things had happened since I jumped off the rock, but the night was about to take a turn for the worst. We were sleeping on the screened-in porch. It was pretty uncomfortable, so we had a very hard time actually falling asleep. I do remember eventually falling asleep, and when I woke up, it was still pitch black. The only thing I could see was the faint outline of my friends sleeping, and the moon's reflection off the river, faintly lighting the areas around it. Something had to have awakened me, but I was not exactly sure what it was yet. But then I heard it. A loud howl coming from the other side of the river. In fact, it sounded like it was coming from the same place I'd seen that figure earlier. I went completely silent and still. It went on for a good 20 minutes in the same spot before finally stopping. I stayed quiet, realizing that my friends were no longer breathing deeply and slowly, because they too had been awakened and had been listening to the howl. Im, who is a Boy Scout, turned to us in the darkness and whispered, "I've never heard anything like that before." I quietly whispered back, "Would you say that was a coyote?" "No, that wasn't a coyote," Im replied. "Too loud, too deep, and we don't have wolves around here either." Now we were all scared, lying on the screened-in porch having no idea what to do. No idea how long until the sun came up. A little while later, the howl came again, interrupting my friends whispering to each other. Same spot, same howl. This time it came every 30 seconds for a few minutes, until I noticed something. It was getting fainter, perhaps moving away from us, down the river, perhaps moving away toward the lake. But then, when we all thought it was about to be over, it changed course and began heading this way. "It must have gone around the lake," I whispered. Im said, "Yeah, it's definitely getting closer." He was right. The howling was getting louder and happened more frequently. Just when it sounded like it was right there, it stopped completely. We were all completely quiet, hardly even breathing. We began to hear twigs cracking under something heavy, and whatever it was, walked near the waterline. The moon's reflection illuminated it. We were all horrified, yet amazed at the same time. It was massive. We have a hammock strung between 2 trees nearby that's about 3 feet off the ground. This thing was more than 2 times the size of it, and it was further away. I would guess it was at least 8 feet tall. Then it began growling. It walked on its back legs over to the cabin. The growling was so close, whatever it was stood right outside the screened porch. I thought it could have just reached right through and grabbed us, but it never tried. It stood there for a while, before slowly making its way back into the woods. The thump of its steps and the branches cracking grew fainter and fainter, until we could all breathe a sigh of relief. We heard one final howl, and then heard it no more. None of us fell asleep that night, and when the sun finally came up, we were ready to leave. Im's family had heard whatever the thing was too, and asked if we had seen what made the sound. We told them everything, and they weren't sure what it was either. One thing is for sure, we all saw whatever it was, and don't plan on going back to that cabin anytime soon. If it's covered in fur and it stands like a man, you're better off running away as fast as you can. I didn't even mean to make it rhyme. I might need to use that again sometime. Copyright 2019, Darkness Prevails. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have a story of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org or darknessprevails.org/submit. If you want to support the show, you can donate, check out our merch store, or start investing with Acorns via my referral link, all linked below in the description. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode, titled 5 Real Rural Horror Stories. Very Rare says, "No lie, I'm actually in the woods right now." Rest in peace, Very Rare. You lived a long, good life. Jar Spencer said, "Horse heads are unisex. Well, in the case of La Llorona, it's always female, but I'm sure there's some horse-headed gentlemen out there too." Laserbeam69 says, "Let's raid Area 51. Let's do it. I want to see some A. Lamaus. Young Seagull says, "All kinds of horror stories." Yup, that's what I do. And Luke Skywalker Indoor says, "Rest in peace, Maverick the Parrot." Well, that's some depressing news. Well, a moment of silence for my beautiful feathered friend. Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, more scary stories are on the way soon, so stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're awesome people. Remember, stay safe out there, and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.